Good evening. I'm going to give Sean a little break here for a couple of Wednesday nights and do a little Bible study on Wednesday night. I thought what might be appropriate at this time, because so many people are in isolation and self-quarantine, would be to talk a little bit about depression, and I'm going to use a story from the Bible to do it. You know, the great thing about the Bible is the Bible does not sugarcoat the truth about its heroes. It gives us the whole story, both good news and bad news at the same time. When the Bible describes the great heroes of the Old Testament and the New Testament, it tells us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about their struggles, their temptations, their difficulties, and their defeats. It tells how they won, it tells how they lost. When the Bible tells us, for instance, about Noah who built an ark, it also tells us about Noah who got drunk and exposed himself before his sons. When the Bible tells us about Abraham, the great father of the faithful, it also tells us how he lied about his wife not once but twice in order to save his own skin. When the Bible tells us the story of Moses, it doesn't just tell us about the great parting of the Red Sea. It also tells us about how Moses murdered those Egyptians, and it tells us how he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock, and because of that was denied entrance into the promised land. When the Bible tells us about David, it just doesn't tell us about the great King David and his kingdom and his victory over Goliath. It tells us about the adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband, Uriah. And when the Bible tells us about Peter, it doesn't just tell us that he walked on water. It tells us about that dark night in which he not once, not twice, but 3 times denied the Lord. So that's one of the great things about the Bible. When it paints the pictures of its heroes, it doesn't just give us the good news and paint the painting in light colors of victory and happiness and joy. It also paints the full portrait with the dark colors of sadness and discouragement and depression. And certainly that is the case when we come to God's great mountain man prophet, Elijah. Elijah was the hero in my favorite story in the Old Testament. Since I was a little boy, my favorite story in the Old Testament was Elijah taking on the 850 false prophets of Baal and Asherah on Mount Carmel. 850 to 1. And whoever's God won the battle and would be able to end the drought by bringing fire from heaven would be the one that would be able to be the true God. And so the prophets of Baal danced around and moaned and groaned and prophesied and begged Baal. They even cut themselves, and nothing happened. And Elijah prayed a simple prayer, asking God to demonstrate his mighty power, and fire from heaven came down, consuming not only the offering on the altar, but all the water that was in the trench. And the people of Israel said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." And all the prophets of Baal were slaughtered. And what a great, great scene it is. One man of God faced down 850 false prophets of Baal. You got to think, this guy is courageous. This guy's strong. This guy's powerful in the Lord. Until the very next day. The very next day. The story at Mount Carmel ends with King Ahab heading back to take the news to Queen Jezebel. And Elijah was so pumped up that he outran Ahab's chariot. And you might think that the next chapter, in chapter 19 of 1 Kings, would say, "And Elijah rejoiced in the Lord his God, and he made a sacrifice to give thanks to God, and all the people came to Elijah and preached to them the word of the Lord." That's not what happens. Instead, Elijah runs away from one woman. one woman, and her threat, and holes up in a cave and begs God to take his life, and shows such signals of depression that he becomes a classic case for even what modern depression looks like. Now look, we all understand depression is a major problem in our time. Every year in America, nearly 10% of Americans are diagnosed with some degree of clinical depression. Depression costs American companies $45 billion a year. Depression is the leading cause of disability in America. And we know that there are lots of causes for depression, and those are things like, those causes are often interrelated. There are things like stress and difficulty in personal relationships and medical problems and poor diet and trauma and genetic factors. We know what some of the symptoms are. They are persistent feelings of sadness and feelings of hopelessness and loss of energy and difficulty concentrating and sleeplessness and irritability, and sometimes even thoughts of suicide. And here's the interesting thing. Researchers tell us that depression seems to be spread across all sectors of society. It's an equal opportunity illness or problem. It's not just for the poor. It's not just for the rich. It's everybody. No one is exempt. Doesn't have anything to do with IQ, with age, or with social class. In fact, some of the greatest people in history have struggled with feelings of depression. For instance, who said this? See if you can guess. I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful soul on earth. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die to be better. Do you know who said that? That was President Abraham Lincoln, who has been voted the greatest president in the history of our country. And I could go on with the great people that we know from history who have been diagnosed with severe depression. Winston Churchill, Ernest Hemingway, Michelangelo, Edgar Allan Poe, Billy Joel, the musician, Marie Osmond, the singer, Beethoven, the great composer. But this is not academic to me. It's personal to me. Because although I have no signs of greatness like the names I just mentioned, I also have gone through a period of depression many years ago that was life-changing. In fact, if you were to ask me, would I go through the depression again that I went through many, many years ago, or the heart surgery I went through in 2004, I'd take the heart surgery in a heartbeat. I would. That's how significant a problem it can be. And so we're going to spend the rest of our time tonight and next week looking at this text and talking about why Elijah got depressed and how God got him out of it. The story begins this way. When Ahab got home after Mount Carmel, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah: "May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them." And you can just imagine the eagerness Jezebel waited for the return of her husband Ahab, thinking they were going to have Elijah taken care of on Mount Carmel. But he wasn't. And when he gave her the bad news, she said, "What happened to the prophets of Baal?" And he said, "They're all dead." And she said, "What happened at the top of the mountain?" And he said, "The Lord God won the day." And so she said, "May our God strike me and kill me if by this time tomorrow I've not killed Elijah just as he killed them." She's saying, in effect, if I can paraphrase that for you, check your watch, Elijah, because by this time tomorrow, I'm going to slice and dice you the way you did the prophets of Baal. So how does Elijah respond? This man who just won over 850 false prophets and trusted God to win that battle, 850 to 1, turns and runs from his life because of one woman. Now, I know some of you men are saying, well, I can kind of understand that a little, but really it's not very understandable. Why be afraid of this woman? Elijah just saw God do a miracle. And he reacted impulsively and was afraid and fled for his life, went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and left his servant there. He is so scared that he decides to run as far away from Jezebel as he can get. And he did so many things wrong here that are the early symptoms of depression. First of all, he was living in fear. Secondly, he ran from his problem. And third, he wanted to be alone and he left his servant behind. And listen to me very carefully. The worst thing you can do when you're going through depression is be alone. The hardest thing you will ever do is get up and go out and be with people and try to act like you're okay and try to be normal. But that's the best thing you can do. The worst thing you can do is what he did. Run in fear and hide alone. That'll only make you worse. He ventured a whole day into the desert, sat under a juniper tree, and prayed that God would end his life. Another thing that he did was he allowed himself to be controlled by dark thoughts. He said, Lord, I've had enough. This is it. Take my life. I'm a total failure. Now, I can tell you right now, he didn't really believe that. We always say things we don't really believe when we're depressed. That's why we should never make a decision when we're depressed. And we should never rely on our emotions or evaluate ourselves when we're depressed. He didn't really believe that he wanted his life to end when he asked God to take his life. You know how I know that? Because if he really wanted his life to end, all he had to do was stay put. All he had to do was stay put. Jezebel would have obliged him. But at that moment, he is filled with self-pity. Having temporarily lost his faith in God and been gripped by fear and doubt, he runs away from his problems. As we look at the biblical record, it seems clear that three things have happened to Elijah to bring him to this breaking point. First of all, he was overwhelmed mentally. It's possible to be under so much pressure for so long that the spring of life is wound so tightly that eventually it must break. I worry about that in this COVID crisis that we're going through. A lot of people have a lot of pressure on them. The spring is wound very tightly. They're isolated. Maybe they've lost their job. Maybe they have an illness. Maybe they have a fever and they start to worry, do I have it? And they're overstrained mentally. And that's always difficult. The great Vince Lombardi was well known for saying, fatigue makes cowards of us all. Everybody has a limit. You got a limit, I've got my limit. It's a good thing to realize when you've come to the end that you should get some help, because even the mightiest oak tree in the forest can easily be brought down if you hit it at just the right place. Elijah was exhausted mentally. He was also exhausted physically. Jesus understood that. Jesus was often exhausted physically. One time he said to his disciples, "Come apart to a desert place and rest a while." For there were many coming and going, and they didn't even have enough time to eat. The great preacher Vance Havner was well known for saying, if we do not come apart and rest a while, we will simply come apart. There's a time when you need to get up and go to work, and there is a time when you need to lay down and take a nap. There is a time when you need to sit in the recliner and crank it back and get a bowl of Cheetos and a Coke and pick up the remote control and watch some old Andy Griffiths online. There's a time to be active and busy, and there's also a time to relax. And that's what Elijah had not learned. He was overstrained mentally. He was overstrained physically. I think that happens with a lot of us at our church. Look, I was thinking while I was working on this lesson that I have preached at this church for 36 years, and I know the people very well. And I know a lot of things about people. And here's some of the things that I know. Deep down, I believe the people at Gulf Coast Church of Christ truly love the Lord. There's no question in my mind about that. If you get to know them personally, as I've done for so many years, you learn that their love for the Lord is genuine and heartfelt, and they really want to serve God, love God, and do the right thing. I've also learned that they're willing to serve the Lord. Now, like every church, we always have a long list of vacancies in our various ministries. We're always looking for teachers and helpers for children's classes in the nursery and the toddlers and the like. But every year without fail, over these 36 years that I've been here, the Lord touches the heart of somebody and they step forward and help. I've also learned this, though, particularly in recent years. Our society is so busy. Almost all of our families are overcommitted. If they have children at home, almost all of them are overcommitted. They got a million things to do. I mean, we all know about the 80-20 rule, which says that 20% of the people do 80% of the work and 80% of the people do 20% of the work. And I'm sure there's some truth to that. And really, it's always true, I think, that there's an inner core of people in every congregation that rise up and do the heavy lifting that must be done to move the church and the Lord's work forward. But I'm not speaking about that at this point. I've discovered that almost every Gulf Coast family I know is overcommitted at home, on the job, in the neighborhood, in the community, in their families, in their extended families, in their church, and outside of church. Everybody is busy just about all the time. One of the ways maybe we need to look at this COVID crisis is it has given us all a chance to pause and breathe. In that sense, that's not such a bad thing. Another thing I've learned is that people in today's world are easily distracted, and that can cause some of the discouraging, depressing feelings that they have. People love the Lord, but they're very busy and overcommitted. And one of the signs of a discouraged, overstressed life is you can't keep your mind on anything for more than 5 minutes. People often ask me why I move all over the stage when I preach, and I do, or why I tell stories all the time, as I do. And one answer is I'm trying to keep people's attention. We live in an overcommitted, overstressed, overbusy generation where people are easily distracted. We communicate in bite-sized chunks because we are such an easily distracted generation. And that kind of thinking, if we're not careful, can cause us to become discouraged. So let's think about Elijah in our last moment tonight. His mind is overstressed. His body is physically exhausted. His eyes have been taken off the Lord and are now on his circumstances. And that's when you start to be under enormous mental stress, enormous physical stress. When you've been running on Red Bull and 4 hours of sleep at night and you've been burning the candle at both ends. No wonder Elijah then gets scared. He's not thinking clearly. When he was on the mountain, in the heat of the battle, all he could see was God, not the 850 false prophets of Baal. They didn't bother him at all. The circumstances didn't matter. It was just Elijah and God. But now, in his state of emotional exhaustion, he sees Jezebel. He hears Jezebel. And where he normally would have stood his ground, he instead reacts in fear, runs for cover, keeps on running until he winds up in a cave on Mount Sinai, hundreds of miles away. So, that's where we're going to leave the mighty prophet of God for the moment. Cowering in a cave, wishing he were dead, feeling utterly alone, lost in his own despair and depression. But we will see in our next study that God is not through with him yet, for even though Elijah could run far, he could not outrun the Lord. Stay tuned. Next week, next lesson, God is about to turn Elijah's life around and use him again, freeing him from his depression. See you next week.